Welcome to the Exploring Washington State podcast. Here's your host, Scott Cowan.
Well, welcome. Today, my guest is David Williams. David is the executive director of the Hydroplane and Raceboat Museum. Welcome to the episode.
Well, it's good to be here, Scott. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, this is going to be exciting for me because as a kid, hydroplanes on Lake Washington, and then, as I'm sure you've heard hundreds of times, we built them out of wood and towed them around behind our bikes.
That's a way you can tell how long someone has lived in Seattle. It's one of those childhood identifiers. You can say, hey, do you know who JP Patches is? And if people say, yes, they've been here. Then you go, hey, do you ever tow a hydro behind your bike? And if you get that glassy-eyed stare like, what? Right. It's a transplant. But if they go, oh, yeah, my favorite boat was Pay and Pack, and I used to paint it with crayons, and then that's a longtime native.
Yeah. We'd tap nails in the back so that they'd spark behind, I'm sure you've heard all the stories about, how creative. So David, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about the museum and how long it's been in existence and what
we do.
Yeah.
Well,
what do you do?
The mission of the museum is to honor, celebrate, and preserve the legacy of hydroplane racing. It was actually founded in 1984, but we really sort of struggled along and didn't have an edifice, didn't have a building where we could display our collection until the early 2000s. And we have at any given time, we have about 24 boats in the collection, but the boats are pretty darn big. So we only have room to display maybe a dozen to 15 of them at any one time. So if when this pandemic is over and you come visit the museum, you won't see the same dozen boats there all the time. We will rotate displays. One of the things that we learned really, really early is that it was much easier to take the boats to people than bring people to the boats. So all of our boats have been restored to running condition. And in a normal year, we'll run them 3 or 4 times, typically around the Washington State area. We'll run in Seattle. We'll run in eastern Washington on the Columbia River and Tri-Cities. We'll run often twice on the Columbia River and then once up on Lake Chelan. But we've traveled quite a bit farther than that. We've been as far east as Buffalo, New York. We've been as far south as Gunnersville, Alabama, and as far west as Honolulu, Hawaii. And we've run just about everywhere in between. So that is a good way for us to bring the boats to people and let them see what a 1950s aircraft, Rolls-Royce Merlin powered unlimited hydroplane looks like and sounds like.
Yeah, like I was saying before the episode when we were at Lake Chelan, being that close to when they were running is, well, you feel it. It's fabulous. It really is. It's amazing. But you mentioned, okay, so you've taken them as far as Buffalo and in Hawaii. Uh-huh. These are not something you just put behind a pickup truck and tow across the country. Or how do you get them to Hawaii? You're not.
Well, Hawaii, we ship them on a steamship line, and you're right. It's sort of a chore to tow these things because they're 30 feet long, they're 12 to 14 feet wide, and they weigh 3 tons. We have really unique custom trailers that will tilt the boat at about a 60-degree angle, because you can't tow down, you can't tow something 14 feet wide down the highway. You'd be knocking over signs and getting pulled over at each state line. So we tilt them at an angle to make them only 8 feet wide, and then they're legal to tow on the road.
And they always get a ton of eyeballs when you're going down the road. I've seen them, in passing through the years, and you're always like, what is that?
It's a funny thing. You have to. I often tell people I am more nervous about driving the boat to the race course than I am about driving the boat at the race course, because when you're towing one of these down the road, people like to look at the boat. They like to get up right next to you and pull out their phones and take pictures, and they don't pay any attention to whether or not your turn signal is on, whether or not you're trying to merge into another lane to take I-90 south, and it's much more difficult driving the boats in traffic when they're on trailers than it is actually driving them in traffic on a race course.
So the race courses, let me ask you this. So these are all my questions. I've always wanted to know, what does it take size wise for, I grew up thinking that unlimited hydroplanes were on Lake Washington the Columbia down in Tri-Cities, and in Detroit. I know that they've raced elsewhere, but those are the three places that I heard. So how big of an area do you have to have? What conditions need to be present for an unlimited hydroplane race?
Well, first you need water. The race courses that we run on now with the vintage boats have to be at least 1.5 miles long and no more than 3 miles long. We don't. We found that for the vintage exhibitions that we do, if we deliberately shorten the courses a little bit, the boats don't run quite so fast, which may not be as much fun for the spectator, but it makes sure that the boats stay at a safe speed. So the race courses, we typically run on our favorite race course. Our best race course would be a 2.5 mile oval. So, but then we have to have specific sizes of the lanes. The lane itself is it's the width of the boat plus 10 feet. So that would be a 24, 25 foot lane, and we need lanes for 6 boats. And then out from the outer course, we have to have 600 feet of clearance to the nearest shore or nearest obstacle, so that we're not, those are insurance safety regulations. So we're usually looking for a spot of water that's about a 1/2 mile wide at least, and 2 miles to 3 miles long. We do run on lots of rivers, but our preference is to run on a lake. You don't notice it if you're sitting at the lake or sitting at the river, but lakes are flat and rivers are not. A river, flowing water is going to follow the contour of the bottom of the river. That's real obvious when you see water flowing flowing fast over rocks, and then you see rapids. Well, that same phenomena happens even when the water is going relatively slow over an uneven but grassy bottom. So when we race at some place like the Columbia River, you don't see any ripples or any change in the surface, but that's fairly rough water. And we're still going 160 miles an hour, and we're going over lumps and bumps that may be 1.5 feet, 2 feet deep. So imagine an Indy car going 160 miles an hour and jumping off a 2 foot tall hill. And our preference would be lakes. Rivers are fine, but that takes a different type of driving and a little bit different setup on the boats too.
So how deep or how shallow of water can you run in?
We can run in fairly shallow water. The boats don't draw a lot. We never would want to run in anything more shallow than 3 or 4 feet.
That's really shallow.
That's possible, but we would like to avoid that and run in 20, 30 foot deep or deeper. Some of the places we've run in the past, Lake Tahoe, Lake Coeur d'Alene, Lake Chelan, have some really deep sections that are over 1,000 feet deep.
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought you could even run in 3 or 4 feet. That seems incredibly shallow to me. That's fascinating. So as hydroplane racing pertains to Washington State, you've written a couple of books. You've written one on hydroplane racing in Seattle, one on racing in the Tri-Cities. I've read the one in Seattle. I haven't read the Tri-Cities one. And one of the things that fascinated me about the book, and I'm a sports guy, or at least I say I'm a sports guy, is you can make the case that the hydros were really the first pro sport to hit Seattle.
Well, you can, and there's a real history is a link, is a chain made of links, or a string of dominoes. And when you start to go back, I can't say that hydroplane racing was the only big time sport in Seattle, because we had the Seattle Metropolitans hockey team back in the 1918 won the Stanley Cup. And we had the Seattle Rainiers minor league baseball team playing at Six Stadium for all those years. But as far as a continuous major league sport that caught the nation's attention, it was hydroplane racing. And it starts, people don't realize that organized powerboat racing is quite literally the oldest form of motorsports. We had our first races on an international scale in 1903, and the first races in the U.S. in 1904. And that was long before Indy 500 or of course, airplane racing. None of that happened before boat racing. So the original powerboat rules were very similar to sailboat racing rules. In fact, they were basically just sailboat racing rules rewritten to allow you to run in a circle instead of a triangle, because sailboat races are generally a triangle. One of the unique things about sailboat racing is that if you won the race, you got the right to defend your race on your home water. That still holds true with the America's Cup. Whoever wins it gets to host it. Same thing was true with powerboat racing. The idea there being if you won the race, you should get a little bit of reward, you get an advantage. So you can defend it on your home water where you know what currents and winds and things are like. So in powerboat racing, if you won the Gold Cup, which was our premier race, you got to defend that at your hometown. In 1950, a fella from Seattle named Stan Sayers won the Gold Cup in Detroit and brought the Gold Cup to Seattle in 1951. Coincidentally, in 1950, a new festival was formed called Seafair. And Seafair's intent was to kind of showcase all that Seattle had to offer. The decision was made to combine this new Gold Cup that had been won that had to be held in Seattle with the Seafair Festival. That race, the Gold Cup, was run in Seattle in 51 through 1955, and it was put on by the Seattle Yacht Club because the Yacht Club knew how to conduct races. In 1956, the Gold Cup went back to Detroit for 1 year, but the Yacht Club decided they'd hold a festival called the Seafair Race. So we've had a continuous race. The interesting thing is, you may not know this, yacht clubs have money. That's a surprise, I'm sure. And guys that have money have power and ambition. Again, facts you probably hadn't considered. So at any rate, you have these rich guys at the yacht club that are putting on this festival, and they get real successful at it. And for a number of years, 500, 600,000 people come to the festival. And sitting around the yacht club talking to themselves, the kind of the power brokers, the movers and shakers that put on the race thought, let's try something different. This is, we're getting pretty good at this. What else could we do? Well, instead of putting on a Seafair, the guys decided they would bid on a World's Fair, and they won the bid. And it's not the exact same boat racers, but the same, the guys at the yacht club that had the money, that had the power, that had the ambition, bid on and won the rights to hold the 1962 World's Fair. And through the World's Fair, we got the Space Needle, the monorail, Key Arena, and a heck of a lot of public attention. As the 62 World's Fair was closing, the mayor of Seattle, a fellow named George Clinton, challenged the promoters of the World's Fair to bring professional sports to town. To bring stick and ball, to bring baseball. And they did. They were successful. And within 6 years of the end of the World's Fair, we got a Major League Baseball team, a very short-lived team.
One
season called the Seattle Pilots, and then they got stolen by Milwaukee and now are the Milwaukee Brewers. But that was okay. They continued to work, and we got basketball, which lasted more than one season, but eventually got stolen too. But we do have three really good professional teams that have come out of that string of professional teams. We ended up with the Seahawks, the Mariners, and the Sounders. And when they needed a place to play, first, when we had just basketball, they played at Key Arena there, which came from the World's Fair. But eventually, the other teams, the Mariners and the Seahawks, had to build the Kingdome and then the stadiums we have now. And I'm not saying that none of that would have happened without powerboat racing, but powerboat racing was the first domino that tipped over. You can take powerboat racing, that led to the civic pride and the group of guys getting together, and then they brought in the World's Fair, and then that led to the to professional sports, and that led to the clink and the stadiums we have now. So it is a continuous line, and that line started with powerboat racing.
Well, in the early 60s, I'm too young to really know that, but in the late 60s, Seattle was a sleepy little town. And we weren't I don't think we were considered a big league town. And I think that without this link, without those gentlemen having the resources, the connections, the drive, the ego and the audacity to ask for a World's Fair and pull it off, and then bring us Major League Baseball, and then go get us Major League Baseball again in basketball and football. Seattle is, a big league city now, and we'll have hockey here next year and have all the big sports. Yeah. So boat racing as a kid, these boats were decked out with names of iconic companies that were local to us. In Thriftway was not in Detroit. And Budweiser became, I just seem to remember Budweiser as being like the Oakland Raiders of hydroplane racing. You either loved them or hated them. Yeah. And they seem to have unlimited money, and, they could do whatever they wanted. And so you would always root. I mean, at least I always rooted for somebody local. What was the impetus that brought advertising onto these boats, though?
Sure.
I mean,
well, to step back a little bit further and to look into the 50s when powerboat racing first came to Seattle, the boats did not have commercial sponsors, but they had really owners that you're going to recognize. Horace Dodge Motor Car. He owned hydroplanes. Edgar Kaiser of Kaiser Steel, Kaiser Aluminum, Kaiser Jeep. He owned hydroplanes. Sam DuPont, DuPont Chemical, owned a hydroplane. And here from Seattle, a guy named Bill Boeing owned a hydroplane. So you had a group of incredibly wealthy, well-connected, powerful men who were all involved in hydroplane racing. At that same time, with that type of wealth, you needed, you were able to run an expensive sport like boat racing. But there were guys that didn't have that type of money but wanted to be involved in the sport as well. So they began looking for commercial sponsors. The first thing that happened is that people tried to run the sport and tried to claim the expenses as a business expense and take that off their taxes as a business expense. The first guy that tried that was Stan Sayers, who ran a boat called the Slow Motion, and he claimed it was a business expense. And in 1956, he got audited by the IRS, and the IRS said, no, not a business expense. That's your hobby. Sayers was a savvy business guy, and he sued. He sued the IRS. And that turned out exactly like you would think a lawsuit against the IRS is going to turn out. He lost, and not only did he owe back taxes, but he owed penalties, and his entire debt to the IRS was about $260,000. Well, a short while later, in 1958, there was a guy named Ole Bardall who lived in Ballard, and he ran a company called Bardall Oil, and he ran a hydroplane called the Miss Bardall. At the same time, there was a fella in Detroit named George Simon who had a company called U.S. Equipment and Tool, and he ran a hydroplane called the Miss U.S. These two guys were a little bit smarter, more savvy businessmen than Sayers had been. They both ran businesses, and they both named the boat after their business, and they took their boat racing expenses off their taxes as if that was a business expense. And again, the IRS audited, and the IRS said, no, this is a hobby. You have to pay taxes. Well, Simon and Bardall joined together in a lawsuit against the IRS, and they had done their homework, and they had kept track of the impact the sport had on their business. Bardall sold an oil, and Bardall was able to show that in Buffalo, New York, in April and May of 1958, they sold 10 cases of oil. And then they raced with the Miss Bardall hydroplane, and they won the race. in June, July, and August, they sold 1,000 cases of oil. So they could show an impact, and they were able to do that all across the country. Simon, on the other hand, used the races as a way to entertain clients, and could show that he brought he sold tools to the automotive industry, and he could show that he brought execs from Ford to a race, and he wined them and dined them at the race, and at that race he signed a contract for $1 million worth of tools, and they both won the lawsuit against the IRS. And in 1963, the IRS determined that that motorsports, based on the powerboat lawsuit, that motorsports was, in fact, a legitimate form of marketing, and motorsports expenses from then on could be treated as business expenses. Well, that led to everything that you see today. That led to, to Winston getting into stock car racing. That led to GM and Chevrolet getting this NASCAR racing. All of the contemporary sports marketing, including probably beer sponsorships and truck sponsorships of big football games, all of that takes its, started with the lawsuit between Ole Bardall, George Simon, and the IRS. That's a long way to sort of answer your question, but that sets up the ability of large corporations to funnel money into motorsports, which if you're going to be successful in motorsports, it takes a lot of money. And if you're not a Bill Boeing or a Sam DuPont, you're going to need a commercial sponsor to keep your business, to keep your race team going.
Because so in the late 70s, when I was paying attention, I'm thinking like Thriftway, Squire Shop. There was some plumbing boat. I can't remember.
Pay and Pack.
Well, Pay and Pack, but I also want to think there was like just a plumber.
Well, there was Beacon Plumbing. Race,
that's it. But that's not
contemporary.
Yeah.
Well, there was a boat called B&L Plumbing, which was sort of a backmarker, also ran. That didn't. There've been a couple plumbing sponsored boats over the decades.
Did these? I seem to remember that the boats would, some of them, the second tier boats, if you will, not the Budweiser corporate, really big corporate sponsors, but would they be carrying one brand in Seattle and a different brand in Detroit? Same. That
became sort of par for the course in the late 80s, early 90s. There were a couple dominant sponsors, Budweiser and RJ Reynolds Tobacco with the Winston Eagle or the Smokin' Joe Camel. Both those operations were willing to put in over $1 million, which was money that was probably well spent for them. But with that money, they capitalized on the media exposure that the sport had and kind of overshadowed some of the smaller teams. So the smaller teams were not able to get enough money through a single sponsor. So they went race by race. And you're right, during the 90s and quite a bit during the 2000s, teams would get $5,000 or $10,000 or a minor sponsor in Detroit and then another minor sponsor in San Diego and just sort of piecemeal together. Instead of trying to come up with a large sponsor for the entire year, they just get individual smaller sponsors.
Which is interesting because I also remember like KISW had a boat, and I think it was successful if it didn't catch on fire. It was.
KISW's made a return to the sport. It's sort of nostalgic, but they continue to run a boat, and they understood that it was marketing, and you didn't have to win to get people to identify with your boat, and they sort of played off the fact that they were a back marker, and to a certain extent in the 70s and 80s, Oberto did something similar, where they created more or less a personality for the team. KISW certainly created a personality for their team, and people identified with that personality and wanted to root for the underdog. And so, yeah,
So how do I want to ask this question? So earlier, we were doing a little research here. I stumbled across an interview you gave last year, and you basically referenced you were 5 and you saw hydros and you wanted to race. What does it? I mean, these boats are doing 100 plus miles an hour easy. 100 and you mentioned 160 earlier. You're 3 feet off the water probably when you're sitting in one of these things, maybe a little bit higher than that, but you're certainly right on the water. There's been fatalities in the sport. How did you get started driving? Obviously you started probably in a smaller boat, but what's the progression that it took for you to go from being 5 and wanting to driving boats now when you're taking out the older boats for shows, competitions?
I wish there was a straight linear progression. Well, and many of the stick and ball sports have that linear progression where you start with Little League when you're a certain age, and then you go to junior high, and then high school, and then college, and then
right.
There are many, many drivers that have made that progression. And mine was a little bit more sideways. And first of all, that there are a lot of people that see something when they're 5 years old. There are little girls that have seen ice dancing at 5 years old, or seen women's soccer at 5 years old, and there are boys that have seen, Russell Wilson at 5 years old. And I want to do that, and it was no different for me as a hydroplane racer. I saw it, I wanted to do it. The very first thing I did, I love my parents very much, and this story probably makes them sound worse than they were, but they were wonderful people. But I can remember at about 13 telling my dad, I really, really, really want to get a hydroplane, and I want to learn how to drive hydroplanes. And he said, well, that's great. You can do that anytime you want. That's absolutely wonderful. But first, you have to get a job, and you have to move out and get a house that has a garage. And then you can buy a hydroplane and you can put it in your garage and you can race all you want. And it was like, you mean you're not going to buy it for me? It's like, no, my dad was a sailboater. He loved racing sailboats. So of course he wasn't going to buy a powerboat. But it takes that type of kind of linear thinking. It takes money to race hydroplanes. And to do that, you have to have a income source. So I did save up money, and I bought my first hydroplane at 18. And I was not a terribly successful racer, but I was good enough to get a job working for a boat builder, and then parlayed that into working for a race team, and then parlayed that into working for a better race team. And through that progression, learned the skills to work on the boats, and never quite actually never bought another race boat of my own ever again. I learned the skills and was able to work on other people's boats and repair other people's boats, and then get their blessing to drive their boats. I did get out of contemporary racing. In the world right now, there's vintage exhibitions and there's real racing. In the mid 80s, I got out of real racing, and it was a period that the sport had become extremely dangerous. And there were probably 4 drivers killed, or 5 killed in about a 4-year period, who were friends who I knew, a couple that I was very, very close with. And it doesn't take a lot to put that together and go, gee, John was a better driver than I am, and here I am carrying John's coffin to a hole in the ground and standing here next to his girlfriend while we bury it. If he's better than me, then why should I be doing this and think I'm going to have any other result? So I got out of the sport for quite a while. I got back in the early 90s when I learned about the museum. I did not found the museum, but I learned about the museum and what they were doing, and figured that was a way to stay connected with the sport and even to drive, but to drive in a safer fashion, where when we did exhibitions, we weren't running 10 tenths, we were running 7 tenths. We were going at 3/4 throttle, and we were choreographed, and it was much less likely for something bad to happen. At that same time, though, I still had the bug. I wanted to race, and but racing itself had become much safer because we had evolved into enclosed canopies with an F-16 canopy and a chrome moly roll cage and a 6-point shoulder harness and compressed air that you could breathe, and it was significantly safer sport. And at that point, I took a slightly different tack to get involved in contemporary racing, where I now had the marketing skills to market myself to a sponsor, get a bag of cash, take the bag of cash to the owner and say, here, this sponsor will give you this money if you let me drive your boat. And that's how I became a qualified unlimited driver and raced for 3.5 seasons. Never won anything. Had fun, gained a perspective, and was also able to sort of check off that childhood dream that, gee, I really got to race in a Gold Cup. I really got to, race at Seafair. And
so, who did you at Seafair? Who were you? What boat were you running?
The first team I drove for was a company called Michigan Mortgage, and we raced back east at the Gold Cup and Evansville. Then at Seafair, I drove for Greg O'Farrell and Lake Ridge Paving. Then the following year, we brought on Albert Lee. So it was Albert Lee, and then I qualified initially in the Oberto. So
I'm while you're talking, I am listening. I'm scrolling on the auction that you guys had
that we just had,
and I'm looking at the Circus jacket.
Yes,
the pink satin. And there was a name. I just like, the Circus. I remember that. I didn't. There's just been some, for growing up around here for people of our kind of age group. I think it was this really nostalgic.
Well, there's an explanation that I try and use for people to help them understand what powerboat racing means to Seattle. And I'm going to use an analogy, a food analogy or a restaurant analogy. When you travel around the country, if you go to New Orleans, you want to have some food that's from New Orleans. You don't want to go to, and forgive me, but you don't want to go to the Cheesecake Factory in New Orleans. You want to go to some funky, fun little, Cajun fish shack. If you're in Boston, you don't want to go to the Cheesecake Factory. You can do that anywhere. You want to go to that little Boston chowder shop.
Yep.
Professional sports around the U.S., and I hope I don't get you hate mail for this, but the football, baseball, basketball, I won't say anything bad about hockey, but those sports are all sort of like the big chain restaurants. There aren't a whole lot of guys that are playing for the Mariners that grew up playing for Garfield and then went to the U of W and then went to the Mariners. Same way with the Seahawks. I don't think there's anyone on the Seahawks that ever played for Bellevue. And maybe one or two players that played for a Pac-12 team, but they're all, I've been lucky enough to live in New Orleans, Atlanta, Seattle, Los Angeles. And the only difference between the football teams or the baseball teams are the color of the uniforms. I mean, there's nothing that's really inherently local. It's a business that's based local, but they have, to me, the feel of that big Cheesecake Factory. Great food. I'm not knocking Cheesecake Factory, but you can find that everywhere. NFL is great ball. You can find that anywhere, but it doesn't have that sort of essence that local high school ball has, if you follow what I'm saying. So for me,
absolutely.
For me, hydroplane racing is that thing that is uniquely and wonderfully Seattle. And if someone from out of town comes in and wants to know what's it like to show me Seattle, well, you take him to a Seafair race because that's local, that's unique, that's something that you're not going to find that in Kansas City, you're not going to find that in Miami. I mean, we used to race in Miami, but I mean, it to me is local and carries the same type of heritage that a really good local market, local restaurant that you'd find down by the Pike Place Market. Not going to name anybody, but.
Well, using your sports analogy, yeah. I love baseball, but I love going to minor league ball. Mm-hmm. And the players are still maybe not coming from the community like the Tacoma Rainiers. There's not a lot of kids that grew up in Tacoma. They're playing for the Rainiers, getting ready to play for Seattle. But the advertising, a lot of the food, the ballpark, Cheney Stadium looks completely different than what Redbird Stadium in Louisville, Kentucky looks like. And there's more of the essence of the community at the minor league level, where when you go to a major league sport, it is way more corporate, way more franchised, like you said, Cheesecake Factory. I know I love the analogy because this is something that to me seems very much like it was a Seattle sport. I know that's naive because they've raced in, like you said, Miami, Evanston, Detroit, Buffalo. I know that, but I still think, and I'm wrong, but I think that hydros are from Seattle. That's how I think it's weird that they wouldn't try to these.
They are. Almost every current team is based out of Seattle. A lot of the drivers come from Seattle, and we have the sport has fallen on, I don't want to say hard times, but we've moved away from professional teams. And professional drivers. I don't think there's any driver that currently makes his full-time 12 months out of the year living off of hydroplane racing. All of these guys, even when they get salary, they don't get a lot. And they're primarily doing it for the love of the sport. And there's an argument to be made for many, many, many years. Our country, our culture idolized amateur sports. And you couldn't compete in the Olympics if you weren't an amateur. And an amateur, if you take the root of that, is a more. It's people that love the sport. That's what an amateur is. He's someone that loves the sport and plays for the love. As we moved into professional sports, we tend to feel that unless someone's getting paid $111 million for 4 seasons, they're not really a good player. And that you're not going to see the best of the best. Well, there's for over a century, the Olympics were completely amateur. Those were only people that played because they loved it. And you had some iconic moments and some tremendous competition. So just the fact that our guys aren't out there drawing, $1 million a year salaries doesn't mean that they're not terribly passionate about it, haven't devoted their lives to it, and aren't really good at it.
Right. So as I'm scrolling and I'm looking on the website, I'm looking at some restorations. Yeah. And now, are these all boats that the museum has restored through the years? The Miss Detroit 3?
The museum has been, people often ask me, well, how many boats have you restored? And it's a tough number to pin down on. I was able to say that we've had our hands in 24 different restorations. We haven't owned all 24 of those boats, and we haven't done 100% of the work on all 24 of those. We've probably done 100% of the work on 18 restorations over the past 20 some years. And of those 18, we probably have outright owned 6 of them. We have developed a really good relationship with a number of benefactors. And it's interesting. Within the nonprofit world, it's very common for a benefactor to support a nonprofit activity. For example, at the zoo, there are benefactors that fund the lion enclosure. That doesn't mean they want to bring a lion home and have a lion live in their backyard, but they like lions or they like gorillas, and they want to support the lions and the gorillas. Hydroplane racing is exactly the same way. We've got some really wealthy benefactors that don't need to own the gorilla to love the gorilla. So they support us in doing the restorations. And then there are a number of folks, probably 3 or 4, that own their own boats, but like the lion or the gorilla, find it inconvenient to have them in their own backyard. So they keep them with us, allowing us to do the work on their behalf. And whenever they want to come down and look at it or drive it or have it at their house to show off for a party or an anniversary or a high school reunion, we do that. So we don't own them all. A lot are owned by benefactors.
So out of all these boats, put you on the spot, what's your favorite boat?
That's like asking a parent who has 4 kids, who's your favorite kid? I love them all, but they're all very, very different.
Let me rephrase. Let me go different. If you were going to take only one boat to Lake Chelan and you were going to drive it, what's the combination? Is there a boat and the lake that you would go?
Sure.
Yes, I'd take this one.
The Miss Wahoo, which is a replica, but it's a replica of the boat that Bill Boeing Jr. used to own, has a significant history on Lake Chelan and is a comfortable boat to drive on the lake and is an easy boat to give rides in. So if you were asking me what would you want to take to Chelan, I'd take the Wahoo. If you were asking me, what's the most fun to drive at Seafair, it would be the Griffin Bud, primarily because the Seafair race course is a very comfortable course for that boat. That course has kind of wider turns and you can carry a lot of speed into the turns. And Chip Hanauer and I have been doing an exhibition side by side for 16 years where he drives the Atlas and I drive the Budweiser. And we're really comfortable and just can kind of let loose and go a little bit faster than maybe other people are going to. And the boats look like they're racing and we trade the lead back and forth. And I always let him win. I always have to let him win because, who wants to see David Williams win a race?
Come on now.
People want to see.
Earlier we talked about the Miss Rock. We root for the underdog. Come on, you got to win one. The Washington Generals win every now and again against the Globetrotters.
I win elimination heats, and he always wins the final. But as far as going to Seafair, that's just an awesome boat to drive at Seafair. It's fast and it's glamorous, and each boat has its own personality, just like each kid would have his own personality.
Each kid, right? So this Miss U district,
yes,
okay, does not look like other boats here. Uh-huh. It looks almost like an airplane from this drawing. And it was a 1957 boat. Can you tell us a little bit? What's the story? And I'm going to link to this boat in the show notes because it's very different looking. So the Miss U represents a wonderful part of the history of boat racing and also a wonderful part of sort of the American culture where people are inventive and try stuff. The Miss U was designed to be a 1-point hydroplane. A fellow named Armand Swenson, who lived in the University District in the 1950s, he ran a gun shop. He actually is well known. He's passed away many years ago, but he was well known at the time for building custom Colt 45s. But Armand had an idea for a race boat. And he built a scale model of the race boat, and I have the scale model. And he took the little scale model out to Green Lake, and he tested it. And oh my goodness, it was the fastest thing anyone had ever seen. I talked to one of the famous designers, Ted Jones, who saw Armand's test the model, and he said, "Oh my gosh, if he could make that work, all of our boats are obsolete." Well, the problem with the scale model is that he built a boat that was about 26, 30 inches long, and he just bought an airplane engine off the shelf, a model airplane engine, and put it in there, and everything was wonderful. But there were a couple problems. One, the model airplane engine had about 5 times per weight the amount of horsepower that a real airplane engine would have. So he was running a boat that had 5 times the power to weight ratio that the real one would have. The other thing was
when you run a model hydroplane, you don't put it into the water, start it, and let it accelerate out of the water. You start it on the beach, you get the engine running, and you come in and you wait up to about your waist, and then you throw it, and it hits the water already going, 20 miles an hour, and it takes off from there. Well, Armin built this boat. It was way underpowered, and there was no great big giant that could hand launch the boat, throw it in so it would hit the water already at planing speed, and it could never get on plane. It's shaped very much like a delta dart. It's actually one big delta with two little sponsons and a propeller directly underneath the center of the boat, and then another almost airplane-looking control surface with a big, tall dorsal fin in back. It just represents that time when anybody thought they could do anything, and let's give it a try. And we don't have any way to computer model it or simulate it or put it in a wind tunnel. But man, this drawing I made on my napkin in the living room really looks good, so let's try it.
Well, it is compared to these other boats. It's distinctive. Did it just race for one season?
It only went to one race.
One race,
and it couldn't get on plane. Never got going any faster than about 40 miles an hour. The legend is that he continued to tinker with it for the next 20 years and eventually got it so it could go about 100 miles an hour, 120. No photographs of that exist. When we got the boat from his widow, it had some unique changes to it, and it may have been able to go that fast. We've elected to return it to its original 1957 configuration, and we'll be hanging it from the ceiling because it really looks cool. But there's none of us really wanted to try and drive it.
So what engine was it? What powered that boat? That's a combustion, that's not turbine. So
that was a straight six engine that actually was very popular in sprint car racing. It was a naturally aspirated, normal carburetor, no supercharger, no blower, and only 6 cylinders. And it was, the engine was called a Ranger. It came out of like a PT-19 World War II era trainer, and not nearly enough horsepower to do what Armin needed it to do.
So in 58, I'm looking at the U40, the Miss Bardol. What powered that boat?
The Bardol, it depends on which one you're looking at. The 1958 Bardol started out with an Allison engine, which was a V12, 1,710 cubic inch blown engine out of a P-38 Lightning. And then later in its career, it converted to a Rolls-Royce Merlin, which is a slightly smaller engine, but with a 2-stage supercharger that put out significantly more horsepower. And that was an engine that was used in the P-51 Mustang, one of the iconic fighters, and another iconic fighter, the Spitfire, the English Spitfire.
So really the Miss U was woefully underpowered compared to the Bardol, even
Absolutely.
in the same era.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Significantly.
Well, and then the other thing here, so where did it go? Well, slow motion, the name.
Yes.
Was there a story behind that?
Yes. Slow Motion was a boat, a team that was owned by Stan Sayers. And there were actually 5 slow motions. And the first 3 were limited hydros. The last 2 were unlimiteds. And when the first slow-mo ran in the early 40s, Stan Sayers' wife, a woman named Madeline, saw the boat. And when he got back to the dock, she said, "Wow, your boat's so fast. It looks like all the others are moving in slow motion." So they decided to name the boat Slow Motion. And it was just that sort of, it became an iconic name for Seattle.
Yeah. No, that's okay. So one thing we talked about before we started recording, and so the Miss Wahoo.
Yes.
It was driven by Myra Slovak, which is another book you've written.
Yeah.
And it looks like there's a pretty amazing story there.
Myra Slovak was an incredible gentleman. And I was lucky enough to become very close friends with him and was able to write his biography. Myra Slovak was born in Czechoslovakia and lived through World War II and the Nazi occupation, and then lived through the Russian liberation. And he said that the Russian liberation from the Nazis was far worse than the Nazi occupation. And then at the end of World War II, when the communist bloc took over most of Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia was behind the Iron Curtain, and Myra lived through the real difficult times of the Russian of the communist era. In 1953, Myra had become a captain in the Czechoslovakian Air Force. He was only 21 years old and was a captain, which is a pretty incredible story, how you get to be a captain at that young age. And there was a shortage of airline pilots, so the Air Force loaned some military pilots to Czechoslovakian Airlines. Myra had already decided he was going to defect first chance he got. So he smuggled guns on board his own airline that he was flying as captain, and hijacked his own airplane, took the crew under control at gunpoint, tied them up with help of a couple accomplices, and flew across the Iron Curtain, being chased by MiGs, and eventually landed in Germany, defected. By a mere chance of fate, when he came across, he had a shipment that had been intended for the Czechoslovakian Air Force. It was a shipment of documents that included all of the detailed construction drawings for a nuclear base. And he turned those over to the CIA. The CIA became incredibly grateful to Myra for what he had brought them and gave him sort of a free pass to come to America. And then they gave him a job working as personal pilot to Bill Boeing. And there's tremendous, I'm glossing over a lot of really, really good story here. But then working for Bill Boeing in Seattle in the 1950s, Boeing decided he wanted to race hydroplanes. And he offered Myra the chance to drive his unlimited hydroplane. So Myra became a champion hydroplane racer, winning 2 world championships and the Gold Cup. He later went on to become a champion airplane racer, winning the very first Reno Gold race, the only man in history to win both Powerboat's biggest trophy, the Gold Cup, and air racing's biggest trophy, the air race in Reno. And Myra dated movie starlets and lived quite a high-profile, fast life. When we were restoring the Miss Wahoo, Myra came up to watch, and he and I became friends. He realized that I was a writer, and he asked me to write his biography. The book's done very, very well. It's called A Race to Freedom, and has recently been optioned by a production company called Vespucci Group, which is run coincidentally by a man who is the son of an expatriate Czechoslovakian who defected during the Cold War era as well. And they've taken an option on producing a movie based on the book. So I got my fingers crossed. Things are going well there. And
that's awesome. That's a very cool story. So okay, wait a second. I'm going to have to ask this question. So the CIA had to become Bill Boeing's pilot. That just seems odd, but I'm sure that's in the book. And so if somebody wants to see that, they're going to read the book, but I want to know, how does he go from being a pilot to being the driver for Boeing on an unlimited boat? I mean, that's a jump.
It is, but at the time, the major hydroplane builder was a man named Ted Jones. Ted believed and was very public about the fact that he thought the boats that he built, the hydroplanes, were more plane than boat and were best driven by pilots. And during that period, there were a number of pilots that had become hydroplane racers without much experience in boats, but lots of experience in planes. So Ted Jones had recommended to Bill Boeing that he find a pilot to drive the boat. Myra's English was not wonderful, and Myra happened to be flying Bill back from a meeting that he had had up in Canada. And on the way back, they began to talk about this hydroplane. And Bill Boeing asked Myra at 20,000 feet as they're flying, or probably 10,000 feet flying home from Canada, so have you ever driven a boat before? And Myra said, yeah, sure, I've driven a boat. Would you like to drive my boat? Sure, I'd be happy to drive your boat. What Bill neglected to ask is what type of boat Myra had driven and how fast he'd gone. At that point, the only boat Myra had ever been in was a kayak. And the fastest he'd gone was 9 miles an hour. Bill never heard that until after Myra was already racing and was able to tell him the story without risking losing his job.
Wow. See, so there's just the history of the region in this sport is just phenomenal. So when you're not restoring boats, when you're not the executive director of the museum, and you're getting out about in Washington State, we always ask people like, where, you kind of touched on this. So I think this will be easy for you. You kind of referenced the Cheesecake Factory. I have this thing. So whenever I'm traveling, my goal is to never eat at a restaurant that I can eat at home.
Of course. Sure.
Okay. That's my goal. That's how I like to travel. And so my only consistent where I break that rule is I'll go to Starbucks because, they have clean bathrooms and the coffee's okay. So I'll go to a Starbucks no matter where I'm at. When you're traveling around Washington, what do you like to do when you're not in a boat? What other things interest you about Washington? You've settled here. You've moved around a bit, but you're here now.
Well, the thing that, and I don't want this to sound too self-serving because it's another plug. The Myra Slovak book turned out to be very successful, and I began to write that book while Bill Boeing Jr. was still alive. And Bill Jr. and I had become very good friends, which is one of the things that allowed me to write the book because Bill is a significant character in that book. Both Myra and Bill passed away while that book was being written. So to finish the book, I had to find people that could give me more information about the story. So I arranged a Boeing family reunion where I got all of Bill Boeing Jr.'s kids together, the remaining ones, and several grandkids. And we sort of had lunch together and told stories and really became friends. And I was struck by, even though they had tremendous wealth and privilege, their stories were not that different than mine. They had favorite pets. They had meals that grandma made that were favorite meals. And that's a long way of saying that I became friendly with the Boeing family. They liked the book and the job that I had done on Myra Slovak. So they offered me the opportunity to write the only biography of Bill Boeing Sr., the founder of the company, that's ever been written. So right now I am knee deep in aviation history, in Boeing history. And so I'm a history buff. The thing that I really am enjoying right now is Seattle history and Boeing history. What a lot of people don't realize is that for Bill Boeing, airplanes were his hobby and the third business that he was in. And he was luckily born into a family with significant money, became a multimillionaire in mining and a multi-millionaire in timber. And then much like Jeff Bezos, who made a ton of money through early in life, took a second business, and Bezos is playing with Blue Origin and spaceships as a hobby, more or less. Bill Boeing was playing with airplanes as a hobby. He was already, long before he ever even thought of building an airplane, he was the richest man in Washington State. So anyway, we've talked about history. We've talked about the dominoes of history. And you asked what it is I like to do. I like to research history, and it's led me to the next book, which hopefully will be out in about a year.
That's fascinating. I had no idea that Boeing was involved in timber or mining. I had no idea. That's amazing. So we're going to wrap this up, but if people want to find out more about what you're doing, your books, I mean, I can drive them to Amazon, but okay. But how about the museum? Currently, the museum's not open to the public because of our current pandemic. We've gone
we've put the museum into sort of a deep hibernation. We still have some of our volunteer crews coming in to maintain the boats, and keep, sort of like, to go back to the zoo and the lions. Even when the zoo's closed, someone has to come in and feed the lions and give them water and clean their cages. So we still have people maintaining the boats. We're not open to the public yet. And we hope to open when it's safe for everybody. But to find out about the museum, your best bet would be to go to our website. And I understand I've got a little bit of work to do on the website when this broadcast ends, but I'll have that sorted out. The web address is an easy one. It's Thunderboats, plural, Thunderboats.org. And that'll get you in, and you can buy books, you can buy videos, you can buy T-shirts and models and all sorts of fun hydro stuff there. And hear about what we're doing, hear when we're going to Chelan next, when we're going to run, and even how to take part in one of our driver schools where you get a chance to go out on a boat by yourself. Not by yourself, go out on a boat with an experienced driver.
So you guys offer, okay, we were going to wrap up, and now you piqued my curiosity. So I can never remember the name of what the Chelan event is called. Mahogany and Merlot
is an event we hold in Chelan. Right. First weekend in October for the last 23 years.
So last year in 2019, I was there with some friends. And what I thought was odd was I've always thought of hydros as being a one-person ride. And you guys had a fundraiser or an auction or something, and you were giving the winners, they could go for a ride.
Well, we offer, it's called driving school, where we offer the experience of learning how to drive a hydroplane, learning how to start it, learning how to how to operate it. And sort of the graduation for that is to go out with an experienced driver and run 3 laps on Lake Chelan. And you'll get to steer the boat and take it through the corner with the experienced driver in the boat with you. And you look like
so. Are those boats retrofitted for a second?
Yes,
passenger.
It doesn't take that much because we take the bucket seat out and we put a bench seat in, or a 2-person side-by-side seat. So the boats never would race with the buckets. Well, in the 50s, boats raced with 2 people often. There needed to be a mechanic to make sure that if anything went wrong on the boat, you could finish the race. So we take the single seat out. We use the single seat if we're running exhibitions, or if we're, but we can take that single seat out and put in a side-by-side bench seat.
Okay. That explains it. Because it was pretty fun. You guys were taking, and I remember watching the guys that were, lucky enough to go along, and they were like little kids. They were super excited.
A bucket list experience. It clearly is a bucket list.
They were really jazzed about getting to go out in a boat, and it was fun to watch. So the museum, they can find you there and all of that. And I just want to say thank you for making this happen, because this has been very enjoyable for me, reliving kind of some of my 70s childhood. And names that I hadn't thought about in a while, like that circus jacket. That was pretty interesting. But I gotta hold you. So you're not gonna tell me your favorite boat, but what's your favorite era of racing?
The part that still holds magic for me is the the early 1960s, 1962, 3, 4, 5, when I was 5 years old and fallen in love with the sport. It just at that time, the boats were beautiful and the drivers were dashing and handsome and famous. And to my way of thinking, at that time, there was no difference between a driver like Bill Munsey. If Bill Munsey was famous, then that put him, in my mind, on the same level as Bart Starr or Johnny Carson or JFK. I mean, they were all superstars. And that's when I fell in love.
Well, I mean, Chip Hanauer was a name. He was definitely a celebrity. I mean, he, in Bill Munsey, they were larger than life icons.
Yes, absolutely.
They were absolutely so. And I'm trying to think, there's one other name that was really big, and I'm just drawing a complete blank of who it is I'm thinking of, but this would have been like the 70s era. Who were the really big drivers in the 70s?
There was Bill Munsey, Gene Chenoweth. Is that the name you're looking for?
That's one of the names. It's like, I didn't think about that, but that's
Bill
definitely
Shoemaker,
a name that I remember. That's it. That's the name. That's actually the name. Okay. But these were guys that, as a kid, we talked about these guys. They were, we didn't have, the Mariners weren't in town yet. We had the Sonics, and I was a huge Sonics fan. But they were celebrities to us, and that was pretty cool. So, thank you. This has been great. And I look forward to being able to check out the museum in person one of these days and just go and, get up close. I don't know how close we can get to the boats, but I'd like to, take a really good look at them. They're art.
In normal times, we even have boats you can sit in. I mean, we're not a museum that has velvet ropes between you and the artifacts. You can touch the boats. You can sit them. If you stand still too long, I'm going to hand you some tools and put you to work on a motor. And that's one of the problems why we haven't been able to open in the pandemic. We're such a hands-on museum. That is such a cool part of coming in, is to let you sit in the boat, let you get your picture taken in the boat. That the disinfecting and cleaning that we have to do after every visitor, either we change the experience so you don't have as much fun, or we have to put in tremendous amount of labor to clean after each visitor. So we've just decided to wait and kind of see how this goes.
See how it all shakes out.
Yeah.
Right. All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Look forward to, we'll be getting this ready to go and publish and all that. And that we'll let you know.
Well, thank you, Scott.
But thank you for being on.
It's been a pleasure.
All right. Take care.
Join us next time for another episode of the Exploring Washington State podcast.